If you've been told to pull up your socks, then make sure it's a pair of TNT socks. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Muckrakers on TNT. Today is Tuesday, August 13th. I'm Taylor Hudak, joined by my fantastic co-hosts, Andrew Eborn and Basil Valentine. Now, during the next hour, we will deep dive into the UK riots, as well as analyze how the political establishment stands to gain from playing both sides on this particular issue. But before we get into that, we will discuss Donald Trump's returning to the X platform, formerly known as Twitter, as well as his 2-hour-long interview or discussion with Elon Musk. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Really looking forward to this discussion. I do want to first begin by mentioning that prior to this 2-hour-long interview, which came at the same time that Trump had returned to Twitter, Musk received a rather, I would say, threatening letter from the European Union, specifically the EU's digital commissioner, Terry Breton. This letter warned Musk that on the platform, being X, that he must follow the provisions within the Digital Services Act, or DSA, in the context of this upcoming interview with Trump, which did stream on the platform, as well as some of the content that has been circulating on the platform regarding the UK riots. Now, specifically, this letter read that Musk and the platform X must take all proportionate and effective mitigation measures and have those in place to help prevent the amplification of harmful content, disinformation in connection with these relevant events. And then at the very end of the letter, it also goes on to state that should Musk and X not comply with the Digital Services Act and these various provisions, that the DSA and those who are in positions of power to uphold these provisions will do whatever they can. They will not hesitate to act, should it be warranted, to protect EU citizens from serious harm. And I have to say, when I read this, I found it quite insulting to the intellect of EU citizens. I think most reasonable people are able to engage on the platform in a respectful way, and that people are able to discern what is outright disinformation or nonsense from the truth. Of course, in times of crisis, things can get a little bit confusing as to certain details regarding a major breaking news event. But I thought this was very reminiscent of, let's say, the Soviet Union. And this is the kind of behavior that we see coming out of dictatorships. So I'll hand it first to you, Basil. What was your thoughts on this letter?
Well, first of all, the interview, which was inexorably dull more than anything else. Two planet-sized egos, a denial of service attack. Trump didn't appear to be on particularly good form at all. I mean, people have even gone so far as to suggest it wasn't even him. Truly bizarre accusations. So it certainly didn't, rise his star, as it were, at a difficult time for the Trump campaign, with Harris Waltz still dancing their way across the United States on their honeymoon. Did you see what I did there? Now, as for the letter, well, Musk has found himself firmly in the crosshairs of European and UK regulatory authorities. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Mark Rowley, has even threatened him with extradition. He posted a meme that some people could say was Islamophobic, claiming that that would get you 3 years in prison in Britain. And of course, he said that the civil war in the UK is inevitable. None of it terribly helpful, but I don't think it goes as far as stoking racial hatred, inciting racial hatred, or any of the other things that currently come under the law. So, needless to say, those who endlessly seek to restrict our freedoms are using every opportunity they can to attack him. He's become something of a bête noire, I suppose, for the liberal chattering classes. Tesla sales may suffer as a result. And apparently Labour Party members of Parliament are quitting X in droves because they don't like what's being said there. Well, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But it strikes me more a case of all the toys coming out of the pram.
Andrew?
I thought it was a glorious interview for all sorts of reasons. It was the biggest bromance when he was saying repeatedly that Kamala, they keep getting her name wrong, so people are not the only one in the media. Kamala, they keep saying she would never do such a tough interview. Well, it wasn't tough at all. What I particularly liked is Trump back on X. There he is. The last time he was on X was this glorious picture here on the 25th of August, or almost a year ago, 25th of August, 2023. That was his mugshot, you might remember. Election interference, never surrender, DonaldTrump.com, which got 316 million. Well, he now posted back again last night saying, are you better off now than when you were when I was president? Well, you know his rhetorical answer to that. Our economy is shattered. Our border has been erased. We're a nation in decline. Make the American dream affordable again. Make America safe again. Make America great again. So a rallying call. And boy, was it easy. My favorite quote, however, from Trump is that he said, illegal immigration saved my life. And his reference to that was he started off by talking about the terrible assassination attempt and how on earth security services failed and so on and so forth. And he said that the reason illegal immigration saved his life is because at just the right moment, he would look down at this wonderful slide that he has saying, look, figures are always much better under him. And that's what happened. That's what saved his life. So nobody's picked up on that other than on the Muckrakers. Illegal immigration saved my life, says Donald Trump. And that's a quote which would be terribly misleading because obviously he's very against that sort of stuff. But there's some interesting stuff, and I don't know how much of you sort of picked out of it, but he said there are massive technical issues. You talk about this, as Basil mentioned, this what's called a DDoS attack, and that caused a delay start. And obviously everybody's turning around and saying, well, that's about freedom of speech, and they're trying to stop him accordingly. About 2 million users joined the event on X, which was very interesting. The content itself, again, they nicked the phrase from the Muckrakers. They said it was a conversation rather than a confrontation. And we love that sort of stuff. It was a free-flowing, people said it lacked structure, but the usual sort of tipping points, if you like, the usual stuff that he talks about, legal issues, the Biden administration, energy policy, all of that sort of stuff. But clearly, as I say, it was a bromance. It was a love fest between Trump and Musk. And I understand that Trump has promised Musk a role as and when, and probably is when now, he gets elected. And Trump was even saying lovely things about the electric vehicles, which he never normally says. But fascinating insight into both people. But to pick up on the speech patterns, a number of people have said to me that it didn't sound like Donald Trump at all. And people have suggested that it might have been an AI version. People might have said, well, you had a lisp, or there might have been some other impediment. But it was an interesting conversation, and one where we wouldn't normally expect to see some little peeking beneath the kimono.
Exactly. And going into this, I definitely did not expect this to be a overwhelmingly professional interview. I expected it to be more of a conversation. However, I've seen some in the media echo this sentiment, stating that this left a lot to be desired. Of course, there wasn't any hard-hitting questions. And I also noticed that Musk himself really made an opportunity to distance himself from the so-called far right. And he said he's traditionally been more center-left or more left-leaning in his political views, but that he very much supported Trump and wanted him to lead the country come November. So that was my take. I've also seen the rhetoric online about how Trump sounded a little bit off. Speech seemed to be a little bit slurred. That could be perhaps an audio issue, but I'm not really sure. I was quite surprised. It didn't quite sound like Trump. Basil, why don't you weigh in?
Well, apparently they talked about everything from radioactive vegetables to the defeat of Napoleon.
They did.
And the irony, of course, is that the denial of service and the fact that thousands couldn't join the conversation. Well, the last time that happened was Ron DeSantis's presidential election campaign launch. And of course, Donald Trump was reveling in the technical issues that time. So nice little ironic twist there. Musk apparently kicked off by asking Trump to describe his attempted assassination, calling his courage under fire inspiring. And Trump had promised the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, you'll never hear it from me a second time because it's too painful to tell. But then, of course, went on to tell Elon Musk.
And he's going back. He's promised he's going to go back to the very scene, and he's going to and he's going to start off by saying, "Now, where was I?" And then he's going to work on that. So basically, the crowd will all laugh and cheer him and fight. It was undoubtedly a love fest. It was undoubtedly playing to all of that sense. The reference to radioactive vegetables, Basil, is when he went to Chernobyl, Elon Musk, and apparently he sort of went there and he ate some vegetables just to prove it was safe. Because what Donald was saying, he was saying, look, people should be very scared about nuclear energy because the radiation will go on for thousands of years. And Elon was trying to say, well, look, don't worry about that. I've eaten some vegetables and there's nothing wrong with me now.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
Now,
you would think that. Go on, Taylor.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on a point that you had mentioned, Basil, which was specifically, related to sort of the reaction to all of this. I made a post on X actually just yesterday about my thoughts on these various Labor MPs who have decided to quit the platform. They are, I understand, making a statement that they disapprove of Musk's policies and that they don't like that he has not, censored more or deplatformed more voices who are pushing perhaps so-called disinformation. But it made me question, how can we count on these Labor MPs to fight for their own constituents if they just give up on Twitter, they just leave the platform because they can't seem to handle opposing viewpoints? Why not fight so-called disinformation or even violent rhetoric with more speech and advocating for peace and providing solutions and also being a problem solver, which is the job of Labor MPs? And I think this feeds into really propping up Elon Musk as being sort of the savior in all of this and the guy that's going to rescue us from the draconian policies that are coming from both the left and the right and the EU, which seek to censor speech. That's just what I wanted to get in there. Any other thoughts on that?
Well,
Elon Musk being uplifted?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a very good point. The legacy of the Enlightenment after the medieval period is that we listen to each other's views. That's the hallmark of a liberal society. And we argue points based on facts and hopefully some agreed fundamental principles about how society should be organized as well. But the whole hate speech, the concept of hate speech was only introduced into our lexicon about 30 years ago. Very, very dangerous because it very quickly goes from speech that appears to be advocating or endorsing hate into simply words that other people say that you hate. So in other words, my hate speech may simply be the fact that I hate what you're saying. And therefore want to get you cancelled, not necessarily that your words are full of hate. And besides, hate is a human emotion. We wouldn't dream of censoring love speech. And it's perfectly healthy to hate and abhor, violence, the genocide. I hate what's going on in Gaza. Is that hate speech? Of course not.
Right. Andrew, I want to get your thoughts on this point quickly before our break. Now, you mentioned hate speech, Basil. In the United States, hate speech is not a clearly defined principle. And in fact, and many people may not like this, but hate speech or hateful speech is actually protected by the First Amendment. Of course, there are a series of tests that the courts will use to determine whether or not that speech in question is a imminent threat and if it is likely to lead to real world violence. But there is a difference here between the UK policies and legislation and the United States. But I know that the UK police commissioner or the Metropolitan Police Commissioner had stated that he may seek to extradite, or that the prosecuting authorities may seek to extradite Americans for violating free speech laws in the UK. Andrew, as an attorney, do you see this as being a potential threat to Americans who
I think what happens
questioning
is
the UK's policy?
Sure. Whatever happens, what you don't want is woolly language. So when you don't define something, that's when you get this woolly language. Mm-hmm. We had a classic example in Scotland about the Scottish so-called hate laws and that sort of thing. And you might remember that J.K. Rowling, as in bowling, came out and said, well, come to me first. You've got to have the right to be able to speak out. You've got to be able to air views that people feel uncomfortable about without that being hate. And the police made the big mistake about turning around and saying, we're going to prosecute going to investigate rather, and then prosecute as appropriate every single complaint. Well, that was a nonsense when you're having crime at an all-time high and various things were going unchecked, if you like. So that soon turned down that sort of rhetoric. But it's glorious rhetoric. And I think we have to be very, very careful because there's some horrendous things that are being said in the name of free speech, but have got dire consequences. And we're going to come on to that when we talk about the riots in the UK. So to the extent there is any sort of incitement to violence, any sort of incitement to commit murder, as there have been on those sort of things, then it's absolutely right. You need to stamp down on those, but absolutely wrong to prevent general free speech and opinions to which you don't agree.
Absolutely. Great place to end this part of the discussion. We are now going to cut for a short break. When we return, as Andrew said, we are going to do a deep dive into the UK riots as well as the UK government response. So that's what we'll be talking about next. You're watching the Muckrakers on TNT.
When the world's endangered animals need help most, when their lives are at greatest risk, when they would otherwise be lost, the International Fund for Animal Welfare is there, taking action to rescue the animals we love, to protect them and their threatened natural habitats. But the danger to animals the world over is growing, and the need for your help has never been more urgent. On land, you'll help stop poachers from threatening and killing elephants and big cats for the illegal wildlife trade. In the oceans, you'll help rescue dolphins, whales, and seals from deadly hazards. And you'll help rescue, rehabilitate, and release vulnerable animals when disasters strike. Here at home and around the world, we can't do this work without you. See how you can help animals and people thrive together at joinifall.org.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back, everybody. Now we are going to shift our focus to the UK riots. Before we get into the details and provide our analysis to the listeners and the viewers, Basil, I just want to ask you, well, both of you are based in the UK, but Basil, has the media representations of the situation been accurate? Many people who are not in the UK would be led to believe that there is violence throughout the entire country, that it's quite unsafe, and that these protests are really disrupting daily life in the UK. Do you think that this assessment has been accurate? And what would you like the listeners to know about what it's like there on the ground?
Well, as usual, the corporate media is simultaneously sensationalist, highly judgmental, and also very selective about how it reports the riots. The word far right, of course, has been attached to all the protesters, some of them violent, some of them very violent, some of them not violent at all, and huge amounts of publicity. Oxygen has been taken up by the government's response, which has been an entirely legal and police response. Indeed, Keir Starmer has made it clear to his troops in Westminster and in the cabinet that he doesn't want anybody to talk about the causes of the trouble. That's because he thinks that would give some validity to those causes. But it's very rare I find myself agreeing with Dame Margaret Hodge. In fact, this may be the only time I ever have done. Labour Party grandee. She said the Labour Party is afraid to talk about immigration. It doesn't make the case for multiculturalism forcefully enough. And really, what the newspapers and television have completely failed to do, with one or two slight exceptions, like GB News, I've seen a couple of pieces on there, is address the core issues, which are that white working class people, we have to use that term, feel disempowered. They feel they don't have any representation in Parliament. And just as for example, the previous Conservative government had introduced a requirement for social housing that meant that you had to be living in or associated with the area, with the borough council to which you were applying for social housing for at least 10 years. Now Labour have removed that requirement. So that kind of thing makes people feel that it doesn't matter if your grandfather died on the Somme and your own father died on the beaches of Normandy, or your family have been in England for centuries. You are no more British than somebody who arrived last week or last year, and you have no more rights to housing or anything else for that matter. So none of that is actually ever discussed, nor, frankly, are the, and this is the touchiest subject of all, but the fundamental demographic changes taking place in Britain. Now, some estimates are that Britain will be a Muslim majority country, an Asian majority country, perhaps I should say, by 2070 or by the end of the century. Now, that's still 35, 40 plus years away, but nobody ever voted for that kind of sea change. And nobody wants to talk about it either. The idea originally was that while South Asian families traditionally have more children than European Christian families, in the long run, that wouldn't continue to be the case, that the family sizes would reduce to those that, we're used to having to perpetuate the population here in Britain. But that isn't the case. South Asian immigrants, second and third generation, are still having large families, and then they have them younger. And therefore, quite simply, the demographics are changing on a fundamental level. Now, you can say, well, it's racist even to notice that. Shouldn't even notice it. We're all the same and all the rest of it. But, identity politics has been injected into our political vocabulary and the way we relate to each other over the last 20 years. But it seems only in certain circumstances are we allowed to talk about it. So, the media never want to talk about these very thorny subjects. The Labour Party certainly doesn't want to. Starmer doesn't want to talk about the causes of the riots. The government's response is entirely a police and prisons one. And it's been very successful because there hasn't been much trouble for over a week. And with the prospect of prison sentences being handed out, long prison sentences, that even for just being in the vicinity of a riot, that can see you arrested and detained without bail. That's one of the things that Musk objected to, and quite rightly so. So, we're not out of the woods on this yet. And this is one of the few forums, today's News Talk, where we are giving at least some airtime to these most difficult of subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, any thoughts on what is the motivation behind these protests? One of the concerns that I had and that I expressed, I think, a few weeks ago when we discussed this very issue on this program was that a few violent individuals who are being reported on extensively in the media, or these riots being violent, being reported extensively in the media, has led people to associate anybody who questions the immigration policies within the UK as being associated with far right, with violent rhetoric. And I think that this could perhaps be intentional. So do you want to weigh in here? Do people have legitimate reasons to protest on these issues?
Well, they certainly have legitimate reasons. And Basil mentioned about demographics. Well, them are the graphics. And I should point out the brilliant team at TNT. We always forget to mention this because we have these wonderful green screens. But the graphics today, you can probably recognize those are Keir Starmer's eyes and 1984 beneath that as well. And it's obviously Starmer, as we warned beforehand, about Starmageddon. So congratulations to CJ, Cam, Mike and Jenny. Brilliant stuff as always. We love it. But to your point, I think the point is this, is that if we go back to what people said was the catalyst, was the horrendous murder of 3 little girls. BB King, who was 6, Elsie Dot Stankham, who was 7, and Alice de Silva Aguirre, who was 9. And you might remember it happened at Southport. It was at the Hart Space Centre during what was a Taylor Swift dance party, effectively dance class. And what happened is a particular channel now 3 now, channel 3 now, which I've mentioned on this show, and I've got Jeremy trying to track them down so they can come on and explain themselves. They put out some false information, misinformation, saying that it was a particular Islamic chap. They even named him wrongly, and that caused all sorts of problems, which has forced effectively the person who was actually arrested and charged, Axel Rudakubana, who's a Welsh native. He lives in Banks, Lancashire, has been charged with 3 counts of murder now, 10 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of possessing an offensive weapon. He actually was born in Cardiff. You know, his parents came from Rwanda in 2002 in search of a better life. But his mother is basically a stay-at-home mother. His father's a taxi driver. And they were described as nice and normal. But it was about this misinformation that was spread by Channel 3 now. And I checked on their website beforehand, the Twitter page, and they've still only got 3,423 followers, one of which is me, because I want to see what they're up to. And they're only following 22 people. What happened? It's wrong. The anti-immigration riots, as they've been called, was sparked by this wave of disinformation by Channel 3 now. It has absolutely nothing to do with the murder of 3 little girls, to why people go in and loot and steal television sets and so on and so forth is absolutely abhorrent. And even the families and the various funerals are taking place over the last few days, and there'll be more expressions of grief. It is abhorrent that people have hijacked the grief and the tragedy and the absolutely appalling circumstances regarding the murder of these 3 little girls to effectively go around looting. So in answer to your question, there are certain situations, there are legitimate concerns about immigration. And we spoke about Elon Musk and his conversation with Trump yesterday. And basically what they were saying, look, immigration is front and center. Trump was proudly saying, look, under him, the immigration figures were coming down. He was going to build this wonderful wall. He was still building it. Those are still his plans. But he needs to get it under control. And he needs to say, well, legal migration is fine. We need to work at what's happening on that sort of basis. But people have legitimate concerns, and those concerns need to be addressed. But in amongst all of that, there are thugs, absolute thugs, who are hijacking people's grief, hijacking legitimate causes to effectively inflict all sorts of violence and disruption. And that is wrong.
Yes, the problem with the violence is that it shuts down the national conversation before it's even started, because the protesters can be characterized as far-right thugs, and therefore there's no need to engage with them at all. And the legitimate concerns you mentioned, Andrew, is simply never addressed, and that causes further resentment. I mean, you've got to go back decades in some ways with this to the disassociation between the working class and the Labour Party that was originally founded to represent working class people. Back in the 1970s, you had a lot of trade unionists in the Parliamentary Labour Party, a lot of working class MPs, up to and including the likes of Harold Wilson himself, of course, who went to Oxford University but came from a working class background. Lots of trade unionists were in Parliament, like I said. Now that's all finished. Now it's the metropolitan elite that have taken full control of the Labour Party. They parachute candidates in from all over the place into the safe seats. And so as a result, I mean, we know it was self-evident after Brexit, large swathes of the country are what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables in the United States. Yeah. They're the sort of great mass of British Tommies. Now, they're not all racist, far from it, but they've seen their country change irreversibly over the last 25, 30 years or so, and they didn't vote for it. And they're feeling left behind. Now, the important report produced about inequality from the Afro-Caribbean chap whose name escapes me for the moment. I'll bring it up later, which commissioned to look into inequality and resentment, said that it's undoubtedly white working class people that have been left behind the most. That really irritated the lefties because, of course, they want to reduce it all to identity politics based on race. So, these are some very, very difficult issues. And as I say, if we go back 50 years, the Labour Party was a very different beast. And so the working class felt they had a voice in Parliament. They don't anymore.
It seems very much that the British establishment does not want to look into or discuss the potential systemic issues from within the UK that could be causing this violence, or at least causing this outrage or just general unhappiness with the current state of affairs, especially as it relates to migration and immigration from within the UK. And this bit of information is very interesting, given that there has been several reports, and one recent report that I do want to discuss coming from the Times, it was just published yesterday, which seeks to state that according to former MI6 officer Christopher Steele, that there is clear Russian involvement with these UK riots, and that they are linking that to Tommy Robinson somehow being taking part in this. And we know that, of course, he has been encouraging people to go out there and protest. However, I would argue that there's far more evidence to show his connection to Israel and Israeli organizations and think tanks, not so much Russia. And we know, of course, this plays into sort of the political or geopolitical issues that the UK is faced with right now. So any comments that you have, Andrew, perhaps on this recent article? Yeah. Do you think that there's substantial concern about Russian involvement, or is this just sort of a joke, really?
Well, it's certainly not a joke, and I think all of these things need to be taken seriously and investigate. But I always urge everybody to question everything. And there's a lot of misinformation around Tommy himself. And I thought it might be worth sort of at least looking at some of the facts. His real name, for those who don't know, is Stephen Yaxley Lennon. Stephen Yaxley Lennon. He was born in Luton, which is not too far out of London. I've got lots of good friends there. In 1982, he's got a history of hooliganism and so on and so forth. He founded what was called the English Defence League in 2009, and that was a movement focused on Islamophobia and opposing what he claims was the Islamic takeover of the UK. His rhetoric tends to target Islam and Muslims. He portrays them as a threat to the British culture and security, and he's been involved with other far-right groups and movements across Europe. From what I last saw, he's sunning himself in Cyprus at the moment, avoiding what's happened there. Right. All sorts of legal troubles. He's got a lengthy criminal record, including violence, fraud, and contempt of court. And the biggest thing at the moment, the misunderstanding at the moment, is the reason for the arrest warrant is to do with a defamation case, and it's to do with contempt of court. And what happened in the recent rally that he held here in London is that the defamation case said he was never to repeat particular accusations against a Syrian schoolboy, and he'd made this documentary which had lots of allegations and interviews and so on and so forth. And what he did during this rally, he basically broadcast that documentary, and as a result of that was contempt of court, and the warrant for his arrest was issued as a result of that contempt of court. But he's now run off, and he's currently in Cyprus, as I say, avoiding that sort of stuff. But it is important to get the facts right and say, look, what is he actually standing for? There are legitimate concerns about immigration. It was certainly front and centre of the election that we have here. It's front and centre of the election they're going to have in the US. But we need, as Basil rightly says, to have a sensible conversation. Violence is not a sensible conversation. What we need to do is to work out certain immigration, legal immigration, is essential to oil, if you like, the economy. We need certain people in a job. And there was a wonderful tweet by somebody, no, I would change the name, but no, Ryan, the Dr. Ahmed did not take your job from you. And Ryan is depicted as with 2 teeth and half an O level in woodwork and claiming benefits. So we need a skill. Where there's a skills shortage, we need to make sure that appropriate people are brought in. But that's legal migration, and we're making sure that sort of works. In the care sector, for example, we need to make sure there are sufficient people who can do sometimes the jobs we don't want to do, and it's working on that sort of premise. But the reality is the illegal ones that need to be dealt with, properly processed. And there's a brilliant movie I often reference called I, Capitano, which shows the other side of it, the horrendous people traffickers, and how people are basically murdered, tortured, their families are extorted as a result of trying to get to what they consider to be a safe place. We need to clamp down on those gangs, and I think that's the right sort of rhetoric that we should be looking at.
Basil, any information you want to share regarding the EDL's background? I've seen some reports come to light recently that specifically suggest that the English Defense League, which of course was co-founded by Tommy Robinson, is likely a spin-off of the Jewish Defense League. And in fact, there's been some reporting about the co-founder, Paul Ray, co-founder of the EDL, who infiltrated various pro-Palestinian movements and then reported specific information to various intelligence agencies. This individual also has ties to various well-known Zionists within the United States. Do you have any other information that you'd like to share regarding Tommy Robinson, his background, that could help maybe give some context as to who is pushing for people to continue to be involved in these protests and riots?
Well, Robinson, of course, changed his name from Stephen Yaxley Lennon to Tommy Robinson to sound more British, to sound like, Tommy was the nickname for the average British soldier in the Second World War and before. So that's why he did that. Duplicitous from the start. And yes, the English Defence League apparently has had very close links to the Jewish Defence League, which is listed as a terrorist organisation. And Benjamin Netanyahu, in his speech to Congress and repeated statements, has very often made it clear that he sees his destruction of the Palestinian people as somehow mirrored by struggles in the West against Muslim immigration. The two, of course, are nothing to do with each other. Robinson is often depicted in a Mossad T-shirt. I've heard that he's been sighted in Tel Aviv in the last couple of weeks. I can't confirm that. But without doubt, there has been Israeli involvement in stoking these riots and the association of the Israeli flag with the Union Jack. You see one or two Israeli flags appearing at far-right demonstrations. That's a departure from 30 or 40 years ago, when traditionally the far right in Britain were anti-Israel. And the irony here, of course, is that the very Muslims that Robinson objects to, particularly those coming from Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, are refugees from wars inspired by Israel. It was, the Israelis that were so keen to take down Saddam Hussein. They're constantly bombing Syria. And of course, no one in Afghanistan had anything to do with 9/11. And a lot of the people coming to Britain by boat come from that part of the world now. So it's very, very deep irony there. Yes, I mean, what Robinson does, and he's a bad faith actor, is exploit genuine fears and concerns, not in a legitimate way that emphasizes civilized debate, but in this thuggish, violent way, which actually, ironically, again, of course, has the reverse effect. It means that these subjects become buried under condemnation from politicians, media, pundits, and talking heads. And as a result, we don't have the national conversation that we've been so desperate to have for decades. I mean, in the years after the Second World War, the so-called Windrush years, people were invited to Britain from particularly what we called new Commonwealth countries. That's the West Indies, West Africa, and particularly South Asia. And then also Edward Heath admitted all the Ugandan Asians after Idi Amin said they all had to leave or he'd kill them. But then at the end of the 20th century under Tony Blair, he decided he wanted to change Britain's demographics forever by allowing basically, much, much less restricted immigration from all parts of the world. Now, just the other day, the Foreign Office were forced to deny that it had issued 450,000 visas to Nigerians in the first 6 months of this year. Apparently, the figure is actually more accurately 250,000 visas have been issued to Nigerians in the last 12 months up to April. But that's a lot of visas, 250,000 in 1 year. If you do that for 10 years, it's 2.5 million people. Now, that's the equivalent of 4 or 5 times to towns the size of Leeds. Now, nobody ever voted for that. And so people do ask themselves why government feels it necessary to expand the economy. I mean, that's partly perhaps why they do it, to make the economic figures look good, by importing so many people when, as we now see, we've got a housing shortage and we're going to be paving over the green belt in order to house Britain's rising population, rising entirely because of immigration. And finally, the illegal immigration. Well, 700 people arrived on Sunday by boat, nearly 20,000 this year so far. And I was talking to Jason Liasatos, who's a community leader down in Totnes yesterday. He said a chap came in his gallery, suicidal, can't find anywhere to live. And as I said, as far as social housing is concerned, you don't have to have any connection with the place. But he can't get housed. But if he'd arrived in Britain by boat on Sunday, he'd probably be in a hotel by now. So that's the kind of thing that never gets discussed. And that's why people are angry.
Yeah, well, and we are discussing it here. What I love about it here on TNT, we can keep doing that. And you can go to the government's own website and see those statistics. So 700 people, as you say, on the 11th, and a horrendous amount. And this was I referenced this tweeter saying that we're not all racist beforehand. This is the one that I saw. No Gary from Blackpool with 1 GCSE, 2 brain cells and 3 teeth. Dr. Ahmed, the surgeon, did not steal your job. There we go. So it's trying to put out, we're not a racist country. It's trying to work out this legitimate
Britain is
concern.
a remarkably tolerant country,
Absolutely.
but exceptionally tolerant country. I was chatting to former kickboxing champion from Bangladesh, film producer Ali Jacko a few weeks ago on TNT. He's made a fantastic life for himself in Britain, son of Bangladeshi parents, grew up in the East End, now a film producer. He was down at the Cannes Film Festival. He told me there's no racism in Britain.
Well, he's not right on that, but we're not racist generally. I think that's right.
All right, guys. Seriously, fantastic discussion here. Really important to lay out that historical context. Next, after the break, I do want to focus on the solutions. What Keir Starmer, which, by the way, his eyes are our background today. Those are Keir Starmer's eyes that are gazing back at you. So we will discuss his policies that he has put forward if we are in a situation in which is a problem reaction solution. We'll get into all that in the way forward just after a short break.
While serving in Vietnam, a grenade took my ability to see. Today, I'm a sculptor, creating new visions. Now, my fingers are my eyes. As a veteran, I know the challenges of life can be great. In my art, turning a lump of clay into something beautiful, that means a lot to me. Life is like that. We each must use what we can to make things better.
DAV helps veterans like Michael get the benefits they've earned. They help more than 1 million veterans every year in life-changing ways.
Now, I show others how they can create something with their own hands. With support from DAV, more veterans can shape their lives into a thing of beauty. My victory is bringing beauty into the world.
Michael Naranjo, may your victories inspire many more. Support more victories for veterans. Go to DAV.org.
She was reading at a 2nd grade level in kindergarten.
Pod force swimming before she was 7.
Finally convinced mom to get her ears pierced in the 3rd grade.
Came in 2nd at her 5th grade spelling bee.
Drill team in the 7th.
And with 1 stroke of the keyboard,
1 click of the mouse,
it's gone.
It's gone.
It's gone.
Report a cyber tip today.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Thanks for sticking with us, guys. Okay, I now want to look at the reaction, what policies have been put forth by the British government. I remember the last time we spoke about this on the program, it was just a few hours later after we were warning of a potential draconian response to these riots. Keir Starmer gave a speech or gave an address to the media. It was rather short, in which he encouraged for predictive policing programs to be used by the police. He also announced the setting up of a new violent disorder unit, and he also made a warning to social media companies to really get it in check to prevent further disinformation and violent rhetoric from being circulated online. And one of the concerns that I had was that this was going to be eventually, if not immediately, used against journalists, dissenters who were reporting information or providing a perspective that went contrary to the establishment. I really think that there is a substantial concern that this is really the end goal to all of this, to further restrict movements, which is, again, something that Keir Starmer has advocated for, to surveil people more, to implement further use of AI as part of a pre-crime policing strategy. I mean, this is what we're really facing here. This is the heart of the issue, that the UK is going to become an even worse police state and surveillance state than it already is. Basil, what is your thoughts on this? Do you think that the response has been disproportionate to the problem?
Well, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said he didn't think the Online Safety Act, which was only passed last year, and the stipulations of which are just coming into force now, he didn't think it was fit for purpose. So they promised to do a review of that. Apparently, Twitter can be fined up to 10% of its global revenue. That would amount to, many, many millions of pounds. So I'm not sure how they'd billions. Yeah, I'm not sure how they'd be able to enforce that. They want social media companies to be able to react in real time to take down offensive or misinformation or disinformation posts. Now, Musk shared something the other day about Starmer planning detention camps in the Falkland Islands for dissenters, which he might like to do, but that isn't currently in the plans. Now, was that satire? Certainly, if I'd looked at it, I wouldn't have taken it seriously for a moment. But other people did take it seriously. And this is one of the problems we've got, is that you never know how seriously to take any of these claims. The claim that the horrible incident in Southport was the result of somebody called Ali, who was an asylum seeker, that was plain disinformation. And people have been quick to jump on that and claim Russian interference. So, it is a minefield. I like to think that, the fundamental rights and freedoms of the British people, as enshrined in Magna Carta and re-established by various presidents since, will hold. But Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, has said, you can expect a knock on the door. We've got some as Andrew said, we've got some very badly defined language about harm and the relationship between online harm and real world harm. And
yes,
a lot of this is very, very woolly and open to different interpretations.
Right. Andrew, I want to give it to you next, but I just want to lay out a few points, a few ideas that I had when just looking at this entire general issue. And that is, yes, it is wrong to purposefully, with intent, put forward disinformation with the intent, as I said, to cause harm or to deceive people. However, when there's breaking news, as journalists, as reporters, as commentators, it's the job of us to report to people what has happened, to keep them informed. And we always do our absolute very best to get the facts straight. And isn't it somewhat unreasonable to expect absolute perfection every single time at your job when providing facts? Of course, there's going to be moments where people slip up, make a small mistake, and then they immediately correct it. What I'm concerned about here is that an innocent mistake can then be criminalized, and you could be penalized for getting something wrong when you didn't have the intent to cause to deceive others. I mean, that's kind of the trajectory that I think we are headed in. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, very simple. Freedom of speech is priceless. But I think I've often said this, we're drowning in a sea of information, most of which is false. And in 2017, fake news were the words of the year, according to Collins Dictionary. And last year, 2023, AI was the words of the year on that sort of basis. If you combine both of them, it's a very dangerous fusion. But often they say, it's the old quote, if you read the newspaper, if you don't read the newspaper, you're ill-informed. And if you read them, you're misinformed. We have an obligation in the media to make sure we don't just instantly rush out to get first with a particular story without checking some of these facts. And as Basil pointed out, even Elon himself was misled, and it might have been a bit of irony, it might not have been. He himself deleted the post, so he didn't say it was ironic or anything else. He deleted the claim about these detention camps, but he posted it very, very quickly. The difficulty is this: in any crime, there are two elements from a legal point of view. There's the actus reus, which is the actual act of doing something, and the other is the mens rea, the guilty mind. So I think absolutely, if you have clarity that you're deliberately spreading misinformation with the intent of stirring up hatred, with the intent of inciting violence, then absolutely clamp down on that. But what you mustn't do is shut down genuine journalism where we hold people's feet to the fire and express opinions that people might disagree with.
Exactly. Unfortunately, I don't think that it is unreasonable to be fearful that these new policies or policies that we already have in place will lead to censoring of truthful information. This happened with COVID, Ukraine, and on a number of issues. This is the history that we have to look to, in which this has already happened time and time again. And also, I just want to point out that I am not somebody who is a big fan of Elon Musk. I'm a little bit skeptical of Elon Musk, and this is it by looking at the things that he has done. He has worked with Israeli-based tech firms, which have been used for the, say, verification process on Twitter, which is actually why I have chosen not to verify myself on Twitter, because I didn't want to fund his mission. He wanted to create or make Twitter an everything app. He is all about the digital ID. So I have some concerns there. And I know that right now, Elon Musk is very much being uplifted as the savior of free speech. And I would just caution everybody to think critically about that and be a little bit careful on that as well. And also, too, as you mentioned, Andrew, he is putting forth information that he should know is going to cause a stir, and it is going to lead to some disarray, let's say. And it is quite interesting to me that he is sharing some of these some of this information when he knows very well that he has a very powerful voice and that he could be penalized for doing so. But anyways, those are just my thoughts. Basil, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, apparently Lewis Atkinson, the Labour MP for Sunderland Central, has begun collating a list of MPs from his party who used Threads, which is the Meta / Mark Zuckerberg alternative. So they can all talk to each other there. I don't know who else they'll be talking to, because Threads has, frankly, a psytiny following. You're right about Musk. He was in the gallery during Netanyahu's homicidal psychopath speech to Congress, applauded by all those performing seals. So, he's far from a total paragon of virtue, but I do respect the way that he allows Twitter users to say pretty much what they like. And that really does need to continue. It is the global public square these days. We're in a very different era from when we all just used to buy newspapers and watch our television sets in the evening. And the fact that you can engage with public figures via social media, I can write a comment on a post by people right up to and including the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain. They might not read it, whatever, but nevertheless, that engagement has actually enhanced our democracy, and we need to, preserve it and continue with it rather than shut it down.
Yeah, just a couple of points to pick up on, Basil. I never want to pick up on Basil, but I'll give you some stats because it's always helpful. Whilst Threads has declined, and I do use Threads myself, basically it still generates 26 monthly million downloads in 2024, and has over 200 million monthly active user base. So there's quite a few people there on that sort of premise. So I think it's important to look at that. As regards Elon, I mean, going back to the interview which we started today today with. He's not exactly impartial anymore. He's made it very clear, and he said this deep into the interview. I don't know if people got all that particular way, but he said to Donald in this bromance, as I say, it is essential that you win for the good of this country. Now, that's not an impartial journalist. It's not a difficult interview, but that's what he said. And if you work on that sort of premise, it was definitely a love fest, going back to Basil and his words of hate and hate speech and everything else. But this was a love speech, and that's what Elon was doing with Donald last night.
Basil, quickly, any final comments you have?
Well, as we always say here on today's News Talk, without freedom of speech, you don't have any freedom at all. With respect to the UK riots, I'd like to see a national conversation about immigration without even, as soon as you raise the subject, being dismissed as far right. People have even been calling for Nigel Farage to be arrested, but all Labour seem to want to do is screw the lid on the pressure cooker, and that won't solve the problems.
Excellent insights. All right, gentlemen, this has been a fantastic, very interesting discussion, one that will absolutely continue because we have to keep thinking about, okay, what is the way forward? Is the appropriate response to have a central authority on the media or digital services to dictate what is acceptable speech? What is not? Exactly. I agree with you. That is definitely not the case. And so we need to respectfully, peacefully, and legally counter the DSA, Digital Services Act, and the upcoming EMFA, European Media Freedom Act. We should expect more censorship under both of these policies put forward by the EU. There's equivalents, of course, in the UK and in the United States. We need
Absolutely.
to
Just very quickly before we go, Teddy, an awful lot of the lies that were told about during the whole COVID farrago still stand to this day. So ultimately, we may have to end up in court to decide what's true and what's false.
Sure, absolutely.
The truth, thank you, Andrew Eborn. There you go.
Yes, thank you, Andrew Eborn. Thank you, Basil Valentine. And I want to thank you all for watching The Muckrakers on TNT. Catch us at the same time tomorrow.